This is The Comics Alternative, episode 294, reviews of Coyote Doggirl, Baseline Boulevard, and Cemetery Beach #1. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sterg, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And on this week's episode, Sterg and I are going to look at three recent titles. We're going to begin with Lisa Hanawalt's Coyote Doggirl. After that, we're going to look at Baseline Boulevard by Emmy Guinness. And then we're going to wrap up with the first issue of Warren Ellis and Jason Howard's Cemetery Beach. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of The Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover, but occasionally you can find discounts that go higher than that.
For instance, Cemetery Beach #3 is on sale for 40% off, the $239 cover price. And also, the book we're talking about this week, Coyote Doggirl, is solicited also for 30% off. It's $16.07, so go check those out.
That's right. You know, you really can't beat the incredible prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Be sure to go to their website, dcbservice.com, and find out about all of the specials they have this month. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Sterg, we hit the other day a milestone with the Comics Alternative, at least in terms of its interview series. On Friday, I put up an interview with First Second creator Yousef Daoudi. He has that new book that is just coming out, I think, this week on Monk, Thelonious Monk. It's a wonderful portrait. And I mentioned that because that was the 200th interview that we've done on the Comics Alternative since we separated our interview series from our weekly review shows.
Wow, that's an impressive number.
And then on Monday of this week, I put up an interview with Jason Lutz, and so that's the 201st interview that we've done. So that's a big milestone, but you and I are going to be coming up on another, and I think more impressive milestone later this year. Now, this episode that we're recording for this week, and it will be going up on the 26th of September, will be episode 294 of the weekly review series. So we should hit 300 before the end of the year. Wow, so you're like the Cal Ripken of academic comics podcasts. Yeah. Well, we are now.
Oh, well, we are. Well, you are. I kind of feel like I'm still playing the little rookie ball, but I'm getting there.
Okay, on this, our 294th episode of our weekly review show, we're going to start off by looking at Lisa Hanawalt's Coyote Doggirl. This came out back in August from Drawn and Quarterly. This is an interesting book, and maybe one way that we can begin, Sterg, is, let me ask you, are you a fan of Lisa Hanawalt?
You know, it's a funny thing. I've checked out other things by her. I know that Hot Dog Taste Tests, it's a previous collection she did. I think Drawn and Quarterly published that last year. And it was one of those books that everyone put at their best of the year kind of things. And I tried reading it, and it just didn't seem like something that appealed to me. And I never read it. So I know she does, she's a producer and an illustrator or an animator on BoJack Horseman, that series on Netflix, but I've never watched it. So I kind of came to this slightly cold because I didn't know a lot about I know that she had done things, but I hadn't read any of the things she had done or watched any of the things she had done.
You know, I'm glad that you said what you did on a number of levels. I mean, along with you, I have not yet seen BoJack. What's it called? BoJack Horseman?
BoJack Horseman.
BoJack Horseman. I had wanted to check it out before we recorded this episode. I didn't have the time to do so. But I'm also curious to hear your take on Lisa Hanawalt, especially regarding Hot Dog Taste Test. Now, I did read that book back in 2016, not long after it came out, because Gwen Tarbox and I, at that time, did an episode of the Comics Alternative devoted to Ignatz Award nominees, and that was one of them. I thought the book was fun. I absolutely love Lisa Hanawalt's sense of humor. But one of the things I came away with in terms of Hot Dog Taste Test is I kept asking myself as I read this, is this a comic? I thought of it as more of an illustrated humor book than a comic, at least in the traditional sense. Now, we tend to have an expansive definition of comics here on the Comics Alternative. So, yeah, I guess you could consider it a graphic novel or a longer work of humorous comics. And while I appreciated her sense of humor, I don't know if I would have read Hot Dog Taste Test if it weren't for the fact that we were doing an Ignatz nominee episode. Now, I have not read her 2013 book, My Dirty Dumb Eyes, either. But I know that she's done, as you pointed out, animation. She's also done work along with others, books for younger readers. For kids and whatnot. And I think that her sense of humor is perfect for a lot of younger readers. So, you know, sometimes there'll be really ridiculous humor, sometimes scatological humor. I know that on her website, if you check it out, and that's lisahanawalt.com, she has up a webcomic called Toilet Comics. So, again, she does have a really interesting sense of humor, and I can appreciate that. And so when we decided to discuss Coyote Doggirl, I didn't know exactly what to expect. I wondered if it would be, let's say, a more traditional narrative as we usually discuss in terms of the comics we look at on the podcast, or if it'd be something more in line with Hot Dog Taste Test. And I think that it's more the former than the latter. There's a lot of humor in Coyote Doggirl, and sometimes ridiculous and even juvenile in a good way humor. But we do have a discernible storyline.
Oh yeah, that's the thing. What you just said. When I looked at Hot Dog Taste Test, I think the thing that bothered me is that it wasn't comics, and I expected comics. And it was funny, like you said, but it just kind of seemed like an illustrated book where, you know, there were jokes, and that wasn't what I was looking for at the time. And I came to this book, I think Drawn and Quarterly put a preview up. It showed up on Twitter or something. And I read the preview, and I think the first 9 pages are on it. And in the first 9 pages, I mean, you talk about a narrative. It's like it's a hook, and it's kind of got a little, you know, there's a little aside here where it's kind of funny, but it's really serious. And it starts, you know, just in a very gripping manner. And, you know, the end of the first little vignette, it's a huge cliffhanger. And that really hooked me. That made me really, really want to read this. So I went out and snapped it up, even though Hot Dog Taste Test didn't seem like a thing I really liked. But I was like, oh, if this is a narrative, I'm going to jump all over it. And like you said, it's a book I really enjoyed. It's one of those books that I think is relatively brief in a way. Like it seems breezy as a read, but it's got so many facets to it. I mean, it's got multiple adventure sequences. She lives in different places, the dog girl, the Coyote Doggirl. And there are funny parts. There are parts that are just kind of a little illustrated bits. I mean, she's an artisan, so there's parts where she just kind of shows off her wares or things that she's made, and they're just kind of random pages. Or that page that's like her inventory. It's almost like a video game. It's like, I have a saddle, I have a knife, I have a, it's like a weird version of like Oregon Trail or something like that. But I don't know. There's so many parts to this book that it's kind of deceptively complicated to me because it's so well developed as far as like a piece of world building to me. It's a very realized locale, and Lisa Hanawalt obviously loves horses. That's another thing I got from this.
You know, you mentioned world building, and I think that is a really nice way of describing, especially the first part of Coyote Doggirl, when we're first introduced to some of the main characters and the things that define the protagonist, Coyote Doggirl, and her horse, Red. You know, even before we get that list of accoutrements, right, such as, stirrupless, McClellan-style saddle, simple single strap snaffle bit. We do get things like pants and halter top, but even before we get this information, we get 2 pages, or I guess a 2-page spread of a map, right? And it looks like, kind of like the inventory that we were discussing. It looks like something that a kid would illustrate in terms of creating a story, or maybe even a game when it comes to world building. So, for instance, on this 2-page spread on the map, we find Coyote's house. And then to the east of that is lots of cactuses here. And then just south of it are the Red Mountains. And then east of the Red Mountains, Old Lady's Cabin. Yeah. And then east of that is a place where apparently Coyote Doggirl writes, "This guy owes me money," in one of the houses. And then to the east of that is marked mountains, ? I don't remember. So, I mean, this is a map, but it's one with a sense of humor. And I mentioned that this could be something that like a kid would illustrate in terms of creating a world, maybe even a game, because when we go through that page of some important information, right, with Coyote Doggirl's inventory and her wish list, the way she describes herself is Coyote Doggirl, half dog, half coyote, wilderness skills, 8 out of 10, intelligence, high, attitude, too much. And we also have some, which is the kind of description that you would have in a video game. Same thing with Red, intelligence, average, endurance, excellent, speed, very good, hooves, great. And then we have the height, 14.2. What is that?
I think it's HH. Is that hands high?
I don't know, but that would make sense, I guess. So, this is, I think, a really fun introduction to the story. And you're right when you said a moment ago that it is a fairly quick read, or maybe another way of putting that, it is a relatively straightforward, stripped down narrative. Because what we have at the very beginning is Coyote Doggirl, and she is riding Red, her horse. She's being chased by 3 men, and she is not exactly sure how she or if she can get away from them. We don't know, at least at first, why they are after her. And it reminded me, when I first started reading this, of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where they have people following them. And they keep asking each other, who are those guys? And of course, they find out later, just as we find out who the men are that are pursuing Coyote Doggirl. But then as she is riding off and trying to keep out of reach of these 3 men, she is attacked by wolves. In fact, you could call them Native Americans, but I guess the Native American equivalent in this world that Hanawalt created are represented as wolves. And so they shoot her with a few arrows. They end up taking her back to their place, and they treat her, they heal her, and then she almost becomes, not quite, one of the tribe. She loses Red. The wolves give her another horse. She leaves. She eventually finds Red, also confronts the men who were after her. And so we learn why those guys were after her. Mm-hmm. And so we do get a little backstory, and then there is a resolution. So it is a relatively quick and straightforward story.
Yeah, I'd say it's like a brisk read for me because it is stripped down, like you said. And I mean, one of the things I loved about it, I mean, just to kind of go back to that map, and you're talking about it almost like it's very childlike. I mean, there's a good guy woods and there's a bad guy forest, which sounds like Candyland or something like that.
Yeah.
And of course, because it's a Western, there is an old mine, because there's always an old mine in a Western. And I think that's one of the aspects of this book that make it, I think, doubly endearing to me, at least, is that this is a classic Western story. This is not, for all its other, aspects to it and, modern or maybe contemporary aspects or features. It's still here's a person on a horse out in the West by themselves, and they deal with adversity. And depending on it, and no matter what else happens and who else she runs into, that's the central part of this book. It's a woman or a dog girl, Coyote Doggirl. Sorry, she's got all these identity markers, which makes it, I think, interesting as well, because I think that's the thing that makes this book complex, is that the identity of Coyote Doggirl and her being this hybrid character operating in what is usually a very black and white narrative where there are good guys and bad guys. You know who to root for, you know who to root against. And then, the story plays out, and usually there's a showdown and somebody gets shot, and then you feel good at the end. Well, typically you feel good. Sometimes you feel bad if, it's an art movie, right? And then the bad guys win, and then, it's about nihilism or something like that. Sorry, I'm getting into like some kind of film talk, but
it's a visual art, as comics is.
It is, but this is, for everything else it's got that basic motor of, this is a Western. It's horses, there's shooting, there's people being pursued, there are people trying to make their way in the middle of nowhere, where there are snakes that can bite you and things that can kill you at every turn. And I think that's what got me at the beginning, because I'm used to reading or watching Westerns, and the protagonist of a Western in the first scene or act usually doesn't get stuck with arrows like a pincushion, fall off the horse, and look like they're dying, like right off the bat. Right. Usually there's a lot more before that happens. So that's really what hooked me. I mean, that at the end of that scene, I mean, she gets shot up pretty well, and then falls off the horse, and then I was like, where does the book go from there?
Yeah, you're right. That is a really good hook, which is how you described it a moment ago. When you were going over the map, you mentioned the old mine. I couldn't help but be reminded of the scene that I think takes place at the old mine toward the last part of the book. And it's a really minor scene. It doesn't have much of anything to do with the main storyline with Coyote Doggirl, in that she is going by the mine and she hears someone who is down in the mine yelling for help. And so she lowers a rope and pulls out this bear, a bear in clothes, of course. And so the bear thanks her and then travels with her for maybe a couple of pages. And then Coyote Doggirl leaves the bear, and that's that. Mm-hmm. And I thought, had you cut that part from the book, you wouldn't really miss anything, but definitely something that it adds is an offbeat sense of humor, which again, I think goes a long way of defining the kind of stuff that Lisa Hanawalt writes. It's humorous, but also it's humorous in a strange, as I put it, offbeat way.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the thing I really appreciated about, not only Hot Dog Taste Test, but with this narrative, Coyote Doggirl. And we get many instances of Hanawalt's humor throughout. I don't want to list all of them. One I will mention, one of the lines or a couple of pages that I saw early on that I appreciated is, the initial part of the book where Coyote Doggirl is fleeing these three guys that's pursuing her. She hasn't yet been attacked by the wolves and lost her dog or her horse Red. But she says at one point, and the book doesn't have page numbers, but she says at one point when she and Red are at a river, I got to get from point A to point B, and she's talking to Red, and you're my only way of accomplishing this. There's something so fun about this. And then if you turn the page, Coyote Doggirl says, it gives me this juicy feeling. I don't know what a juicy feeling is, but I like it. It's funny.
Oh, yeah.
And so just little things like that.
Oh, yeah.
And there are moments when Coyote Doggirl, or maybe one of the other characters that were introduced to her or to us, like, for instance, the wolves that attack her and then take her in and care for her. Well, where they will say things, funny lines, or even cuss. I mean, there are a variety of occasions where Coyote Doggirl cusses out people who attack her or who are pursuing her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I don't know, there's a lot packed up in this book too. I mean, going back to the bear scene, I mean, she knows what's funny, or how to make things funny. I mean, the bear, like you said, is clothed, but it's like, I'm not going to say he's wearing skinny jeans, but those jeans seem snug for a bear. I mean, he's huge on top, and then he's got these tiny little spindly legs and these little jeans, which is funny. And then he's on a donkey on top of that. So it's like this big bear on top of this little donkey, which to me is just that's hilarious just in and of itself. But also, I think that I agree with you. I think without that scene, this book works. But I think with the scene, it adds a little wrinkle in that it's possible to have encounters with random people and not have it turn to murder or rape, which I think is one of the setups of the book is, once you get to the flashback parts, is that in the West, it's really easy. I think it's in the West, listen to me, in the West, in this classical version of this, these Western narratives, all these people out there on the frontiers just being by themselves leads them to think or act in mysterious ways. And they're so wrapped up in themselves that sometimes kindness gets misconstrued as something else, or kindness actually isn't kindness, but just kind of keeping to oneself and really trying to exercise some kind of control in a different way. And I'm thinking about that shopkeeper when there is the flashback and you learn why those men are pursuing her. And, it's a flashback to a time where she is she's got her little homestead. She's got her little plot of land. She's taking care of Red, and nobody really wants to have anything to do with her. They think she's she's a woman, first off. So that's off-putting. So no one wants to talk to her, socialize with her, except for the one shopkeeper who, like you said, there's no page numbers. There was one man I dealt with regularly. I found his prices and practices to be fair. And she goes in and, she's like, there were weevils in that alfalfa you sold me last week. He says, all right, I will credit you for 1 sack of feed. I pray for this batch to be bug-free. You need help with that? It's like there's humor bound up in all of this. You need help with that? Nope. Oh, this is no job for a woman. And then, that night or a night, that same shopkeeper finds his way to her house and finds his way into her bed and thinks like, oh, we're friendly. I'm going to take something, or we're going to do something. And she, I get so lonely. You must get lonesome too. Nope. She's very clear. Nope, I don't get lonesome. And then he tries a thing, and then she's got a knife, and I won't spoil everything, but things happen that are violent and still funny, actually. And I think that's the thing about this book that really makes it intriguing, is that this guy tries something with her, and she dices him up, almost literally, and it looks cartoonish, like little circles that just come off flesh. Flesh doesn't work that way, but it's bloody.
you're right to point out that there are moments in this narrative that are rather violent and then potentially sad or impactful in, let's say, a violent manner. But she tempers that, maybe not always, but often, I think most times, with humor, either the commentary or, as you were just describing, the visual humor. When she's cutting up that shopkeeper, it's like she's cutting up a sausage, in these even little bits. So another, I guess, violent instance in the book is in the last half when she hasn't found her horse Red at this point, but she is riding a horse provided by the wolves who had taken her in. And when she's out with that horse at one point, the horse breaks its leg, and so she has to shoot it, and then, it's sad, but it's quickly dealt with to where after another couple of pages, as a reader, I more or less forget that. Something else that you mentioned a moment ago, I think is worth dwelling on in a little more detail. You pointed out that with the map that we get at the very beginning of the book, her house is away and to the east of other houses in the community, in Dogtown, I guess it's called. And the men who are after her are represented as dogs. If we want to call them Native Americans, the Indian tribe is represented as wolves. Coyote Doggirl herself is a hybrid. So she's a mixture of coyote and dog. And I think as such, she's an outsider. Okay. She doesn't fit in with one world. It doesn't necessarily fit in with another community. And so that's why I think her house is there on the outskirts, on the borderline, kind of in between things. And so she does come across throughout this brief story as an in-between figure. Someone who doesn't belong to one community or the other, may get along well enough at times, but is someone who's always going to do her own thing because she is in many ways a hybrid character, not anchored.
Yeah, and I think it works in a lot of different ways, or in another way too. She's kind of this throwback character and kind of a very contemporary character to me. Like, I get she's hybrid in that she's partly civilized and partly part of the wilderness or the frontier and kind of traversing those worlds. But she's also, there's some part about it to me that, she's this survivalist. She's obviously able to take care of herself and fend in these conditions where there aren't a lot of affordances, where there's not a lot of, you're kind of living by what you have. But at the same time, she makes this, she does fashion. She's very proud of that halter top she made, that crop halter top that she, outfit designed and sewn by Coyote Doggirl. And when she does spend time with the wolf people, that's one of her contributions, is that she's able to do fashion work or sew things in. And that to me is, that's not part of making it out in the wet. Like that's like parsley or something. It's extra. You don't need it. And so, and just her sensibility too, that the fact that she's got this attitude and the way she carries herself, and, like she's in the part where she's with the wolf people and she's in the tent, and and you don't see her, you just see the outside of the tent, and she's just like so bored. Like she's on the ground, like doing bicycle whirls with her legs, and that to me that's not something you see in a Western narrative. Clearly we have to think, okay, is not always stuff going on in these stories, but usually we expect that's when people are on horses looking wistfully out into the horizons. Like you don't think of that as bored. You think of that as just, it's still, like nothing's trying to kill me in this exact instant. But with her, she doesn't have that kind of sense. She's more of like somebody who is in our world, just happened to be in this Western world, and she acts like maybe somebody of current times would, rather than somebody set in that time period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, I think that comes back to the humor that largely defines the work of Lisa Hanawalt. Is not only are her comics, if we want to call them that, as we mentioned, some may be, but some may not be traditional comics. But in her work, there's a sense of humor, not only in terms of the various jokes and comments that the characters make, but also in the way, in this case, in Coyote Doggirl, that she takes a genre and bends it. Like you mentioned, it's not often that we will get a character in a Western narrative that is bored, and we will get significant narrative space of this character saying, I'm bored. And again, it's part of what she does with the genre. So on the one hand, she participates in what we could call a more traditional classical Western narrative, but at the same time, she turns it on its head in places.
Oh yeah, and I love that about this book, because it's like I said, it's simple. It seems simple, but there's so many things. Even the very first page of the book, where she's like, "Shit, we're being pursued by guys. If you get tired or break a leg, I will be fucking screwed." I mean, she sets up that whole break a leg thing that you don't think about until it happens much later in the book with a different horse, and it's like this thing has come to pass. And one of the things on the very first page, past the maps, I mean, where we get some important information. She just has one is pants, like these are my pants, and it's like, why are you without description, without anything, and you just take for granted she's wearing pants, and then towards the end, she's up in a tree and she's trying to be sneaky, and something breaks and she falls out of the tree. She takes umbrage that they're making fun of her saddle that she has designed, but the tree branch breaks, she falls down, and of course her pants get stuck on it, and she's without pants, which is played for humor and not for sexy time or anything like that. But she proceeds to get on a horse and rumble with these guys without pants on, and it's not something. I mean, it's funny, but it's not something. It's something that's set up very subtly, very early on, and there's a lot of that to this book. It's almost like. I forget the playwright. You hopefully you will know, but the whole, if you see a gun in Act 1, it better be shot
Chekhov.
by Act 3. That's Chekhov, right? So,
yeah, Chekhov's gun.
But it's also like Coyote Doggirl's pants. Like if you see the pants in Act 1, they get there's a use to them in Act 3. Even something like you don't think of, like pants.
That's funny. I never thought in reading and then rereading Coyote Doggirl of Doggirl's pants within the context of Chekhov's gun.
There you go.
There you go. And you mentioned a moment ago that when she rips her pants and is just in her panties at the very end of the book, or toward the end, it's not really played up for, I think, as you put it, sexy time. That reminded me of, I guess, a more adult quality of this story that we get toward the very beginning. And this is at the beginning. We've already mentioned this. The some important information section when we're introduced to who she and Red are, pants, halter top, the stirrupless saddle and all that. But then we get Coyote's wish list, and she has several kinds of saddles, like the warm winter saddle or the ladies' side saddle. And then there's one that's weird called the water saddle. But then there's one that is called pleasure saddle, and it's a saddle with, I guess, various dildos built into it. And I mean, this is not necessarily an adult book. I think that to some degree it could be appreciated by younger readers. And I say to some degree, I don't want to suggest that this is something that younger readers should pick up, because there are moments, as you've pointed out, where you do have language and certain, I think, adult scenarios. But especially with the pleasure saddle on Coyote's wish list, I don't know. It kind of underscores Hanawalt's sense of humor.
Oh yeah, I mean, I love it in a way, because it's I'm not gonna say it's shock humor, but it's something that'll jolt you. It gets your attention, and she juxtaposes things that you don't expect. She's very good at. I mean, part of what makes humor work, at least for me, is, when you see something in a place that you don't ever want to see it or don't ever expect to see it. And that's kind of how this book works to me. I mean, she's really masterful at at taking a serious scene and throwing a joke into it in a way that is like, it could be the most horrible scene, but the joke is funny and it's a really great joke. And so it makes that scene very complicated emotionally, or at least my reactions to it, because I want to be horrified. And I'm kind of like, why am I laughing so much? Because there's this ridiculous thing that's in the middle, this ridiculous element in the middle of like this horrific thing, or vice versa, where something is really funny and then there's just one terrible thing in it. Or if you're just looking at something, to me, that's rather boring, like, oh, saddles. And then you kind of get, that pleasure saddle. You're like, what? I mean, some of those marital aids, I'm going to call them marital aids. I mean, they are very geometrically interesting. It's just what I'm going to put there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's I've been living in Tennessee too long. I'm marital aids. But yeah, that's one of the things I love about this book. And it's also very, like, the style of it. The story is rather serious most of the time, but the artwork is very cartoony. And to see these, anthropomorphic animals kind of traversing around is one thing. But then the colors, it's hard for me not to talk about this book without talking about the colors, because there's all these little watercolors, and to me, it's gorgeous. I mean, it's like, there's sunsets, there's purple clouds, there's mesas, there's earth, there's, when you get to the wolf people and you look at like their tents and things like that, I mean, there's intricate beadwork and gorgeous paintings and the feathers. Like, to me, it looks like just, there's a lot of love and care in this book too, which, even the map on the front page that we were talking about, I mean, it's gorgeously rendered in terms of, it's like, it's got simple little symbols that kind of indicate the geography. And it's got those text pieces where they describe all the various locales, which, mostly are funny. And I would be remiss if I don't mention that of course it has a crystal lake. I mean, she didn't put like a hockey mask or anything like that in it, but of course there's a crystal lake in the middle of this place. But it's just, there's so much detail to it that it seems like it's well planned out. She sets things up. She uses them. She's well tempered the drama with the comedy. The colors look gorgeous. The artwork, the line work is rather simple and very expressive. But the colors just pop, and there's scenes where, there's drama. And the way the book ends, I mean, to me, it has kind of two endings. And I'm really worried at the end about this book, because it looks like Coyote Doggirl, for everything she's gone through, is losing a lot of blood at the end of this book.
Yeah.
And it's like everywhere. And then, like I'm worried for what's going, I don't know. I'm thinking, man, you can't lose that much blood and have things be okay. But I won't ruin the ending, because it's kind of open-ended. I hope that there's a sequel. I hope that we get to see more Coyote Doggirl, personally.
You mentioned the watercolors, and you're right. I think the coloring of Coyote Doggirl is really impressive. But another way that she uses watercolors is when she separates, I guess on the one hand, you could call them chapter breaks, right? One chapter from the other, where you have a page of like different watercolor washes, where one color kind of melds into another. And then we get to the next chapter. Or sometimes it's not a chapter change, I think, but maybe a change of scene, like going from one act, so to speak, within a chapter to another.
Right.
And so she uses watercolors in terms of transition. I wonder if she will come back to this figure, Coyote Doggirl. If our listeners don't have the book and they want to check it out, or at least the first chapter, as it's called on her website, they can go to lisahanawalt.com, and if they click on comics, then they'll get a list of, the things she makes available online. But the first chapter, which is basically the story up to the time she gets arrows shot into her by the wolves, what you call the cliffhanger. So that first chapter, she calls it, is available online, so you can see what we're talking about. But she says if you go to her website and click on Coyote Doggirl for a sample, she says, Coyote Doggirl is a Western adventure comic I started a few years ago. I've been adding to it bit by bit between larger projects. And then she says the graphic novel will be published by Drawn and Quarterly in fall of 2018. So if this is something that she has like occasionally added to here and there, then who knows? Maybe it's possible that she will continue to come back to this character and add more to the story, and maybe we can get a Coyote Doggirl too.
Yeah, I would love to see that. I would definitely check it out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Sterg, you want to move on to the second title that we're going to be looking at for this week?
Sure.
Yeah, and this is Baseline Boulevard by Emmy Guinness, and this came out earlier this year from Kilgore Books and Comics. Now, I was a backer of Dan Stafford's Kickstarter for this year's Kilgore Books and Comics releases. Were you?
I was, but I was selective in what I got. I think I got the Evan Van Sciver package.
Okay, so the new Blammo and some of the earlier stuff.
Yes, I my Blammo collection is much more filled out after that.
Yeah, I went ahead and we're in fact on a future episode we're going to be talking with Noah Van Sciver about not only his most recent issue of Blammo but other things he's come out with recently, which is a lot. But I had a lot of the past issues of Blammo. I went ahead and just went for all of this year's releases from Kilgore because I really like what Kilgore does. They're one of my favorite publishers that we keep turning to. Now I did get a physical copy of Baseline Boulevard, but we should mention that if people want to check out what we're about to discuss, they can go to Emmy Guinness's website, which is emmyguinness.com. That's EMIGENNIS.com. And if you click on the comics link, you will see the entirety of Baseline Boulevard. And in fact, I went through the online webcomic of Baseline Boulevard and compared it to the physical copy that I had gotten the other month, and it's the exact same thing. So there's no changes, no editorial readjustment, it seems, in the printed version. So people can read this online, but I do suggest that you get a hard copy of Baseline Boulevard from Kilgore Books and Comics, and definitely support Kilgore Books and Comics. Now, for those who listened to last week's episode when I released a variety of shorter conversations that I had with creators at this year's Small Press Expo, they'll know that Emmy Gennis was one of the people that I talked to briefly. And one of the things she pointed out was that she appreciated the fact that not only did we discuss her previous book, The Plunge, back in November of 2016, at the time we were doing a Kilgore Spotlight, but she said, you're one of the few people who actually pronounced my last name correctly. And she told me that most people seem to call her Emmy Gennis.
Which I can appreciate personally. When your last name is Batsakis, you're always being mispronounced. So I know I commented to you before we put on the mics. I was like, you said her name right. And I did verify Emmy Guinness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, we do, Emmy, if you're listening to this, we do like to pronounce your name correctly. And and now we want to discuss your comic, Baseline Boulevard. So this is I guess a relatively short narrative, although there's a lot packed into it.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's what, before we get going, I was curious to ask you about the hard copy and how it was laid out. If it was laid out, I mean, because online, I read it online, and it's basically scroll down, for five little chapters, or it's broken into 5 sections anyway. And is the comic, how many panels are on a page?
Yeah, that's a good question. Copy? For the most part, every page contains 2 panels. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, if you look at the webcomic version and the first 4 panels are consistent in terms of size, that's what you have as the primary layout of the print version, where you have two of those, I would call it comparatively smaller panels per page. Mm-hmm. However, there are occasions where you will have a longer panel taking up an entire page. And so we see those represented as longer panels on the webcomic version of this. As an example of that, there is a scene, and I think as you're clicking through the online version of this, where, and we'll get into the way that this narrative is constructed in a moment, but since we're talking about page and panel layout, there's a scene, okay, if you go online and you are on, I guess what you could call the second web page, okay, with the Emmy Guinness character, because as she points out, this is autobiographical in nature, hugging a former lover, and the panel begins to break apart or shatter, kind of like glass. And so you see what seems to be one long panel, but is actually, I guess you could argue, two, of the various pieces of the broken up or shattered panel that are flying apart. And then right underneath that is another panel of birds flying. And in the book, those are represented as two longer panels that make up an entire page.
Gotcha.
So anytime you have a longer panel or a longer image, then it's a single panel on a page. Other than that, you have two panels per page.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for answering that. I was curious.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about, I guess, what the Baseline Boulevard is all about and how the narrative is structured. I think that upon first reading, individuals may be a little thrown, at least at first, about what's going on. And we see at the very beginning, and we really don't get that in the printed version, although online, again at emmyguinness.com, if you check out Baseline Boulevard, she describes this as an autobiographical story about grief. So at least when I first read the physical or print version, then the woman at the very beginning, I didn't know at first that this was the autobiographical Emmy Guinness. Later on in the story, this character is referred to as Emmy. And so then, okay, this is a little more autobiographical than I thought. But in the web version, she says outright at the very beginning that this is an autobiographical narrative. But we see a young woman with longer hair coming out of a grocery store with some flowers. And then she's in traffic. And one of the things I like about the driving scenes, and we see things as Emmy would looking out of her windshield. So we at times see her driving, but more times than not, when she is on the road, we see, so to speak, what she sees out her window. In the various buildings, businesses, and whatnot, we have the shape of signs, but we don't have the signs populated with text. And I appreciated that, right? So we have a McDonald's sign, obviously, but there's no text, no words at all on the sign. Same thing with other signs and places that she passes as she's driving. But then we see, after some driving images, a young woman with shorter hair who is interacting, speaking with a man, and you get the sense that they're two lovers, they're having a fight, something's going wrong. And then after a while, you get a sense that, the woman who has longer hair in the car driving with the flowers is the present day, as the story is being narrated, Emmy Guinness. And then the shorter-haired woman is a younger Emmy who is the contemporary Emmy is recalling her relationship with this guy. And so as she's driving, she's thinking back about various moments in that turbulent relationship that we get that these are flashback scenes when we see Emmy with shorter hair.
Yeah, the glasses helped me because I was trying to, much like you, I was trying to puzzle together what was happening. And past Emmy also has her hair is shorter and different color, so it's light.
Yeah,
and
also different
Emmy
glasses.
Yes, Yes, but just the fact that they're I was like, okay, so this is the person who's wearing glasses. Mm-hmm. But yeah, to me, this is. I love how spare this comic is in a lot of ways. It doesn't feature a lot of words at all, and like you said, there's a lot of these point of view shots or point of view panels with her looking out at the road, and they're very spare. To me, it's like, but they don't have the words, but it's just landscapes. And then she kind of focuses on little key details, like the little birds on the power lines that are across the road. And then that kind of sparks her to go back to an owl statue. And that's part of that one fight that you talked about, that lovers spat. And so I don't know. To me, this is very, very elegantly. I love how it's very simple, this story, but it's there's a lot going on in it, emotionally speaking. At least for me, it's very it's short but heavy.
It is, right, and also very well crafted. You know, that scene or that transition that you referenced just a second ago, from the birds on power lines to the statue of the owl. Well, obviously, both of those images have something to do with birds, but I think it's a rather clever way of going from present moment within the narrative to the past. So we have the bird image kind of links the past to the present, and we have other occasions where something like that happens. And in fact, one of the things that really struck me, and I guess this is part of the narrative's sparseness, but at the same time, part of its, how shall I put this? It's almost peacefulness in a way, where, and I think that peacefulness is made up of panels, a large majority of panels where you don't have text, right? You don't have dialogue, especially when we're in the present, is when the current day Emmy is driving out into the country when she leaves the town. And we see these scenes of the countryside. And I tell you, what it did was it reminded me a lot of the Midwest, because it's flat and it's the kind of buildings and farmland and cattle that I would see every now and again. And, you know, those, I don't know what you call them, but the irrigators in crops that look like, as my wife put it at one point, gigantic caterpillars that are in fields. So there's a lot of that, and I appreciated that. And there is a kind of sereneness, I think, that goes into that kind of landscape that she captures quite well.
And it juxtaposes very well with a lot of the flashbacks, because the flashbacks are almost nothing. They're not serene. They're usually these horrible emotional moments or fights or attempts to reconcile after a fight. And so they are not, those aren't happy times. They're not serene times, I would say.
You're right. I mean, there is that juxtaposed contrast between the more peaceful moments of the current time in which the story is being told and the turbulent past that defined her relationship with, I guess, the former boyfriend. Another thing about Baseline Boulevard that really struck me, and this takes place a little over halfway through the narrative. So it comes right after the flashback scene where the boyfriend at night taps on the window and then opens Emmy's window, seems to come into her home and wakes up Emmy as she's sleeping. And so, you know, she's angry that he would, in essence, break into her place. If this is indeed what happened, because at one point we see her without him at the window. Now, did he leave, or did she dream or imagine this to be the case, that he came back? It's unclear. You know, I like that ambiguity.
Right.
But the part that I wanted to point out is right after that, we don't have page numbers in the printed copy. We get a series of black panels. And first it's about 5 shorter black panels, then 2 long single panel pages of a black panel. And then we get 1 long page of a completely white panel. And then we get back to the story of the contemporary Emmy driving out in the country toward the cemetery. You know, I was struck by those blank both black and the one white long panel, and what kind of function that they served. How did you react when you saw those panels?
I was thinking the same thing, because it was just puzzling, because I was like, it's just very, very dark. And what does that mean? Is this a dark time? Is that the rest of that night? I was just trying to piece together what was happening there. And in some ways, I took it metaphorically, honestly, is that, there were lots of dark, like this time just strikes me as kind of a tribulation for her in general. And these dark panels just kind of represent, this is, her horrible mental state at the time, and how it just repeats and repeats. And then there's one really tall one, or long one, or there's two long ones in succession before there's a very large white panel. And that's how I read it. I mean, to me, I think it's very deft, because it's simple. It's just their panels. There's a part of me that, this is a horrible thing I'm going to say, there's a part of me that read it at the very beginning when I was just, my initial read, and I was like, man, this is a ripoff. There's just like pages of nothing. It's just black, it's white, it's black, it's white. But, I think getting into the story and trying to make sense of why she put all these things together in the sequence she did, that really made me appreciate it a lot more. And that's kind of how I took it. I mean, as a scrolling online thing, I thought it worked. Because it's kind of like a repetition, and the fact that she varied the panel lengths, I thought made for a dramatic impact. I wondered how it played out on pages, because I mean, it just looks like dark pages for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that is how it comes across, that series of first black and then the one long white panel that occurs in the narrative after that scene where it seems as if her boyfriend or ex-lover is coming into her place.
Right.
But again, it's a little ambiguous. Is that a dream? Did that really happen? I think regardless, we can look at those blank pages, the black and then the white panels, in multiple ways. I think that it makes a lot of sense to read those initial black panels as a dark place that she's in at that point emotionally in that relationship. We can also look at it in a more literal sense that she's fallen asleep. And so this is kind of a transition series of panels that take us from the past, at a moment where she had gone to sleep, maybe or maybe not had dreamt of the former boyfriend, into a more contemporary story where you have an older or more wizened Emmy driving out in the country. But also I think that those blank panels, both black and white, kind of serve as, I don't know, I think a significant marker, an emotional marker especially, that causes us as readers to kind of pause and do what you and I said that we did, kind of wonder what's going on here, why are they here? And in other words, it brings our attention to the story in a more critical way. When it comes to reading a narrative, you can get so lost in it that you don't think in terms of what the writer or artist is doing to make us feel and think what we're feeling and thinking. In other words, that they're manipulating us in some way through the craft. But I think those blank panels do kind of force us to pull back as readers and wonder, this is, how is the story being told in a way that affects us in various ways?
Plus, I think it works. I mean, it's one of the beautiful things about comics in general is that how do you depict a thing that is undepictable? And I look at those black and white panels. I mean, those moments, especially in the context of what's going on in this story, in that particular moment, what she must be thinking. I mean, it's got to be convoluted and complicated and full of lots of emotions and things jumping around. I mean, it's almost, I'd imagine that the task of trying to put that on paper, that train of thought, would be a huge task. And so I think an elegant solution to that is to kind of go with the black and juxtapose it with the white eventually, just because we get to fill that in ourselves. I mean, it's almost like it's about halfway through the narrative too, when this black and white panel sequence happens. It's almost like a gutter to the story itself. Like if we think about, comics have the gutters are where we make all the inferences. This is the part where we get to fill in whatever that pain, and if it's a dream, if it's real. I mean, all of that is on us. That's on our shoulders, kind of to fill in. And I appreciate that in a lot of ways. I think it's very clever and imaginative. I love how she uses comics, like the medium of comics, to tell this particular story. I mean, that to me is one of the things that I really appreciated about this narrative. I mean, I had to read this thing a few times. I mean, it seems simple, and there's a part of me that was like, oh yeah, a lot of landscapes. So that's like, I don't have to think. I just look at the pretty scenery. But that's not. It's not just pretty scenery. There's a lot of mindful orchestration of images, and the scenes and the story beats are very deliberate. And the fact that I don't know, it's a very heavy topic, like I said, and I think it's one that it's very difficult to speak about, difficult to express. And I mean, there's a part of me that thinks she's very brave for telling this story. It's a very personal story in this fashion, but I'm also kind of cheered on because I think she did it in beautiful, artful manner. I mean, I love the way that she thinks about comics and lays things out. This is almost like it's the perfect marriage of art and emotion and narrative, just kind of put out on the page. And it says she was nominated for multiple awards with this, but I don't know if she won any. She won a cartoonist prize.
Yeah, well, she was nominated. Yeah, and you're right. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because we're talking about Baseline Boulevard as a recent publication, and as a print comic, it is, right? It just came out recently from Kilgore Books in their latest round of publications. But actually this is something that I guess Sean and I could have discussed as a webcomic if we had stumbled across this earlier. But the webcomic in its entirety came out, I guess, in spring of 2015. And as Guinness points out online, that this was nominated for a Dinky Award at the Denver Independent Comics and Art Expo, and also nominated for a Slate Book Reviews Cartoonist Studio Prize in the webcomics category. Now, I don't know if it won the latter, but I think that it's important to note that this has been around for about 3 years. We're just getting a print version recently, but this has already gotten quite a bit of attention. So a belated congratulations to Emmy Gennis for being nominated for those awards.
Yeah, and I hope it's being considered in its new print form, just because this is some great comic telling, let alone beyond the story. And I don't know. I think it should be recognized for such. It's a great, if they're going to call it a single issue or something like that. I mean, this is a great story, like told in beautiful and artful manner.
Exactly. And it's something different from many of the comics you can see on her website that Emmy Guinness has done. So, for instance, her previous book, The Plunge, which we actually did discuss, as I mentioned, on the Comics Alternative a couple of years ago, that's the story of Annie Edson Taylor, who was the first person to successfully go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. And a lot of her other comics are also portraits of historical figures in one form or another. This is different. And although she has written comics where she herself is a character, for instance, there's one you can find on her website called Urine, the Miracle Cure. I don't know if you would call that autobiographical, but with Baseline Boulevard, it does come across, especially since she calls it that, as more outright autobiography. So I'd like to see more of not only her comics in general, but more autobiographical work from her.
Oh yeah, that was on the nib as well. I think was the urine story. Yeah, that's. I agree. I think I just love her comics in general, and she's not someone I had really followed or she'd never really been on my radar, honestly, until I listened to your short interview at SPX and then read this. And I'm kicking myself. I mean, you talk about, maybe picking these up for the webcomic show. I mean, there's so many webcomics. There's so many good people out there. And not to detract from Emmy Gennis's work, because I think it's gorgeous. And I'm kind of in the can to seek out and read more and more from her. But I don't know. I think there's such a proliferation of comics out there nowadays. Good comics that are first in these web presences, and then more and more of them are finding their way into print. That I'm thankful, because there's just so much beautiful stuff out there. And this Baseline Boulevard, it just knocked me on my butt, honestly. And it's one of those things that this is a crazy thing maybe to think of, and I don't know why I keyed on this, but reading through it, I mean, there's not a lot of dialogue, but none of it has punctuation. And that kind of threw me a little bit, because that means that I get to add the tone, and I get to add the volume, and I get to interpret it how I want. And it kind of strikes me as weird, because I think about traditional superhero comics, and everything had exclamation points. It's like everyone's screaming all the time. And then this, I think people are screaming. There's definitely scenes where I imagine they're screaming, but there's no punctuation. So, you can kind of attribute what you want. And I don't know, there's just so many of the moments in this I can't relate to all of it, but there are multiple gut punches in this story.
Yeah. And what you were just describing in terms of the lack of punctuation, I think is most, for me at least, apparent at the book's climax. And I don't want to give anything away, but it's the occasion in the final pages of Baseline Boulevard where we're in the current moment. So we have the contemporary, or the older, more knowledgeable, wizened Emmy, and she screams something, again, I don't want to give it away. And I think of that as the climax of this story, but it's the only occasion where in the contemporary moment that the story is taking place, we have any kind of dialogue whatsoever. Before that, all the other dialogue, we may have sound effects, but we don't have any kind of speech. But it's, if we have speech in the book before this, it's in those flashback scenes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And that's, I don't know. To me, the whole book is not book. It is a book now. It's just it's another one of those study in contrasts. I love that this is in black and white, and because she uses those to kind of balance off, visually, but the story itself is just these moments of calm and tumult, and how complicated emotions are, and our relationships are with people, and how we can love and hate a person at the same time, and how particular relationships, some of them, the one in this, I think in particular, it's something that, she is somehow emotionally beholden to still, even though she doesn't want to be, even though there's been some kind of action that she feels she has to respond to. And the trip she makes, this is a trip that she's just doing this for herself, and the gesture she makes is for herself. And just this response that, even though she's doing it for herself, it turns into, I don't know, it turns into it looks like it's like a paying tribute type thing, or it's meant to do that. And then it kind of goes in a very different direction. And I don't know, I find it a hard thing to talk about. Let alone draw and compose. There's just so much bound up into this that it's complex, yet simple. That last image of, I'm not going to spoil the whole thing, but, the last image of it's basically, tire tracks, that kind of, and nothing, and the rest of the scenery. And that, to me, is a is a beautiful, simple metaphor that contains volumes about this kind of event and this relationship. And to me, that's the power of comics narrative. I think this should be called The Power of Comics Narrative by Emmy Gennis.
Yeah. Well, we've mentioned her website before, emmyguinness.com. I do recommend that if people aren't aware of Guinness's work, that they check out her website, because she does have a number of her comics online. You can see a couple of the stories that she did that appeared in the Nib, You're in the Miracle Cure, and then another story, Trepanation. But then we have some of her earlier comics, many of which are portraits of historical moments or figures. And then you can also read Baseline Boulevard in its entirety. And then we also have an excerpt of that previous story, The Plunge. Now, before we move on to the final title that we look at, I'm wondering when or if another publisher will begin putting out longer form work from Emmy Guinness. And when I mention this, I don't mean to short shrift Kilgore Books and Comics in any way. As I said, it's one of my favorite publishers. We've discussed their publications quite a number of times on the Comics Alternative. Again, one of our favorites. But I know that Dan at Kilgore doesn't have the same kind of distribution as other presses do. And I'm thinking, for example, of First Second. It just strikes me that the kind of story that Emmy tells, whether it be the more historical narratives like The Plunge or Nyos, or her autobiographical stuff that we've been discussing in terms of Baseline Boulevard, that, if these were longer stories, if she wanted to add more, let's say, to what we have with Baseline Boulevard, that it would find a very comfortable home with First Second. You would get more distribution. She could get more attention. I don't know. I just like her stuff, and I'm glad that it's out there and available. So again, people can turn to emmyguinness.com, and she even has a couple things available on her Etsy shop.
Well, I'm going to go check that out. I want to read The Plunge. My dad, for some reason, we went to Niagara Falls 3 or 4 times when I was a kid. So I am in the can for stories about people going over the falls in a barrel.
Okay, let's turn to the last title that we're going to be discussing this week, and this is the first issue of Warren Ellis and Jason Howard's Cemetery Beach. This came out earlier this month. I think it was released on September 12th from Image Comics. And this is notable, if for no other reason, in that it brings together the team that brought us Trees, Warren Ellis and Jason Howard, because both of them worked on Trees together. Now, Sturge, did you read Trees when it was in the initial run?
I did. I read Trees. That was one of the things that actually kind of excited me about this book, because I don't read. Warren Ellis is one of those creators that I know he puts out a lot of things, and I like the things that I've read of his, but I don't actively seek it out for some reason. And Trees I did, and I read, I think there were 2 trades of it. I think I read both of those. And, I know I read both of those, if that's all there was. And I love his approach to science fiction in general. And his character work is usually stuff I enjoy. And this is a book that I didn't even know it was coming out until we talked about reading it for this podcast. So, as an issue 1, it's everything I want in issue 1. It's intriguing. It makes me want to read more. And I think in general, that's what Ellis and Howard, that's what they did with Trees for me anyway, too. There were so many aspects of that story that left me wondering for more. They create mystery, and I kind of want to figure out what's going on with the rest of this book, because it time jumps. It does a lot of things that I'm trying to make sense of it is really the whole thing, which is usually frustrating, but when I'm reading comics like this, I kind of like it.
Yeah. Now, I didn't read all of what we have so far of Trees. And I say so far because from what I've heard, Ellis and Howard are wanting to continue with Trees. But for now, they wanted to, so to speak, fill in the gap with this other series, Cemetery Beach. I read the first part of Trees. I don't think I read past the first volume. So I need to continue to read it on. But I did like what I read. And I can say the same about Cemetery Beach. Now, you mentioned in this first issue of Cemetery Beach trying to figure out what's going on. You know, compared to the first issue of what I can remember of Trees, I had an easier time getting into this narrative world and understanding what's going on with Cemetery Beach than I did with Trees. And I think because, you know, with Trees, the big mystery is what are these structures, you know, these alien structures? What is the stuff that is emanating or oozing from these structures? And what does it mean to the people on Earth that are living literally under its shadow or right at its feet? And so that seemed a little unusual. Now, the premise of Cemetery Beach #1, you know, it's, you know, science fiction-y, it's a tad unusual, but I don't think as mysterious as the initial issues of Trees. Because basically what we have going on in this first issue of Cemetery Beach is whom I'm considering our protagonist, a guy named Michael Blackburn. And we see that he is naked and has been captured by some forces, and we don't really know much about who the people are that seem to have Michael Blackburn captured and chained up. And he comes across as an innocent. He doesn't seem to know much. He says, hey, I'll help you out with whatever. Just don't torture me. I don't like pain. But we learn soon enough that he basically is manipulating his captor. And when he asks for a cigarette and is about to get it, he uses that as an occasion to get away. Michael eventually, in his escape, comes across another inmate named Grace Moody, and she apparently is someone from this world that he has landed on, because we're getting some of the, not much, but some exposition, some background information as we go along. So we know he's on some kind of alien or at least non-Earth world, that it has something to do with Earth's past, and he's there for reconnaissance purposes. But when he comes across Grace, he takes her with him because she's someone who is from this particular world. So he needs a local who can help him get away. And they cause quite a bit of ruckus as they're making their escape. And then this first issue ends, and this is no spoiler, when one of the people from this world tell its, I guess, president named Barrow that these people have escaped. And then Barrow makes a comment, something to the effect of, you know, oh, the old world is here now, or they're wondering what's going on with this. And so apparently we can gather from this first issue that Earth is referred to on this world as Old Home. And that's one word, Old Home. And that the world that Michael finds himself on, that he's trying to escape from, you know, doing reconnaissance on at the same time, is made up of people who have set up home from Earth to this world. And we don't know much yet about the relationship between this current world that Michael finds himself on and Earth, or Old Home, as it's called by the people. And I'm intrigued. You know, one of the things we always point out on the Comics Alternatives when we look at a #1 issue is how many questions or what kind of questions are posed. You know, there's some #1 issues where there are too many questions and there's too much unexplained, almost no exposition, that leaves, at least me as a reader, confused and feeling frustrated to the point that I don't know if I want to read issue #2 and 3. But then there are other issues, and I think Cemetery Beach #1 is an example of this, where there's enough information given for me to mentally grab onto the narrative, while at the same time leaving a number of questions unanswered that will propel me into wanting to read issue number 2, 3, and on.
Yeah, and I mean, today, the 3 books we're talking about are kind of very different ways of talking about how entryways into comics work. I mean, Coyote Doggirl spelled almost everything out. Baseline Boulevard had almost nothing, no context. And this is kind of something in between where you kind of get breadcrumb trail of things, but there's a lot that's left open-ended. And to me, that's one of the things that I thought was most intriguing when Michael Blackburn is being questioned. He just starts this narrative like, oh, my employers discovered around 1920 that a group of industrialists and scientists found and operated a method to travel off-world, which that's just a little detail tossed out there. And to think that, okay, this started in the 1920s, so when is this set? What's going on? And then there seems to be these weird relationships with these other worlds, like this one he's on. They don't really know what's going on Earth, because Michael starts telling him about, oh, we have these, what is he? He's talking about cell phones. He's like, yeah, everyone talks about computers. Everyone talks through their computers. We have these phones. You know that walkie-talkie you have back home? Everyone has them. But now they take photos and television and play music, and they get news and weather, and they're just these little slabs of nearly unbreakable glass. Yeah, and everyone talks through computers now. He's like, you're shitting me. Nope. Computers are the size of books. And the worst thing, guys can send pictures of their dicks to pretty much anyone, anywhere. Now you're just making things up. You know, it's like, I love, and that does two things, because that does a whole lot of like the making up what the world is like here. It's setting up that world building kind of thing that I think Ellis is excellent at doing. Every time I've read one of his comics, like you jump in, he gives you all these big concepts early, even if you don't know the specifics of the narrative. Plus, his dialogue is always snarky and fun to me. Like he's always got a cheeky guy who, you know, is funny. And maybe not likable, but you're compelled to pay attention to what they say, and whatever they say, it's going to be interesting and maybe noteworthy and usually witty. So that to me, this is like a, and I don't mean this in a bad way. Like this is like a textbook Ellis book in that it's beautifully crafted. The characters are strong. They come across almost instantly what their personalities are, and it's just that you don't know what the plot is to this, and that's the mystery that to me is fascinating. Honestly, I really liked it. Yeah,
you're right. And that passage that you read from toward the beginning of this first issue, I think, is important in that here we have Ellis, you know, along with Howard, giving enough background information, in other words, exposition, that we have enough to go on, right? So we know that this world is a colony from Earth, but that at the same time, in whatever ways, for whatever reasons, we don't know yet, it's cut itself off. Because this guy that's interrogating Michael, I mean, he does look like an older figure, right? You referenced his walkie-talkie. He is carrying a walkie-talkie. It's an older kind of walkie-talkie, something that you would see, let's say, in, you know, the early part or the mid part of the 20th century. And even the clothes he has on, his cap and his uniform, seem a little antiquated compared to the kind of world that Michael apparently comes from, which is the world that I guess we live in to some degree, where you do have things like Android and iPhones that have everything, right? You know, not just the quote unquote walkie-talkie aspect of it, but take pictures, chat, play music, send dick pics and all of that. So that, I mean, there is a lot there. And I'm glad that Ellis has set things up in a way that there is a time differential. So for instance, this colony seems to be, from what we can tell, to some degree anchored in the past, although it does seem to have certain technology that does make it a little more, I don't know if you want to call it futuristic or contemporary, but it still seems to be cut off from a world that maybe we as readers are a little more familiar with. There's a lot of action in this first issue.
There is.
And, you know, after the first few pages with the interrogation, when Michael gets away, he meets Grace. So I think a good part of this first issue is the getaway scene. And so we do get to see Jason Howard really take the narrative and move it through his kinetic imagery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to shortchange Howard either by saying, "Oh yeah, Warren Ellis. This is a Warren Ellis book," because, like you said, that sequence is what 7 pages of no words at all, and you get to see the landscape, you get to see the buildings, you get to see what the spaceships look like. You see lots of action and violence and explosions, and that's Howard. That's on Howard. So there's an amazing amount of storytelling and word building just in the visual sense as well, which I think this is a like I said, this is not a series I was planning on following, but after reading this, I'm on the hook for reading this.
Yeah, I am too. And in fact, right now I'm looking at the Image website under Cemetery Beach, and this is going to be a 7-issue series. And as we pointed out earlier, what was it? Was it 3 or 4 that's being solicited now?
3.
I think 3, right? Yeah. So that'll be released in November. So yeah, this will be a 7-issue series. And I'm wondering if after they wrap this up, Ellis and Howard will get back to trees.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was looking at their Wikipedia page, and they've got 2 in the can, and supposedly they're working on a 3rd. So that to me that would make sense.
A volume, you mean?
Yes, the 3rd volume of Trees is something that they want to produce. So hopefully after this, maybe.
Sterg, 3 really interesting titles and fun titles that we looked at on this week's episode. We started off with Lisa Hanawalt's Coyote Doggirl, which came out back in August from Drawn and Quarterly. After that, we looked at Baseline Boulevard by Emmy Guinness. It was a webcomic from a few years ago, but just recently, Kilgore Books and Comics published a print version of it. And then after that, we looked at Warren Ellis and Jason Howard's Cemetery Beach #1 that came out earlier this month from Image Comics.
Yeah, it's we hit 3 different genres too. We got a Western, we got an autobiographical tale, and we got a piece of sci-fi.
Yeah,
so we're all around the map.
Yeah, well, we like to mix things up and to provide variety in the comics alternative.
Well, I'm all for that.
Yes. And if you want to find great titles like this, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As Sturgios mentioned at the very beginning of the episode, you can right now find Lisa Hanawalt's Coyote Doggirl at a great discount, as well as issue #3 that you can pre-order of Cemetery Beach. That's dcbservice.com.
That's right, both 30% off.
That's right. And after you do get the comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can contact us the new old-fashioned way and send an email to 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can just email me at sturge@comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can get in touch with us, of course, all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, on iHeartRadio, and on TuneIn. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right, Derek. Sounds good to me.
And we will be back next week with our October previews episode. So buckle up and get ready for that, what will probably be a longish show.
We're going through all 587 pages one by one.
Yeah, it's something I always look forward to at the beginning of every month. Although those shows, as popular as they are, do tend to be longer.
Hey, you get quality and quantity.
That's right. And you can't beat that. Remember, we're the Comics Alternative. We're here for you, our listeners.
That's right. Every single one of y'all.
That's right. Until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sturge.
Take care.
Take care.
Hey, what happened?